Hi, everybody. Nice to see you all here. So my name is Shirley Matheson. I'm the Global NDC Enhancement Coordinator for WWF here at COP28, and welcome to this event on just energy transition and NDCs. So from the title, I think maybe you know why I'm here as the facilitator. And I'm joined by a really great panel of speakers to talk about this. What we wanted to do today was talk a little bit about the Alliance on the Just Energy Transition and some of the key issues around it. And if you've been following the conversations this week, you'll see that just transition has really popped up as a really key issue across. Obviously, we've got the Just Transition Work Programme, but we've got the Global Stocktake as well. And there's been some really interesting discussions on that. So hopefully we can dig into that a little bit. I am joined here by three speakers today. On my left is Joy Hernandez. So thank you for joining us from ITUC, which is, I have got that somewhere, International Trade Unions Consideration. So thank you very much for joining. And on my left, unfortunately, our original speaker is unwell and unable to join us, but Omar El Manui from Don't Gas Africa is joining us instead. So thank you very much for stepping in. Very welcome. And I welcome my colleague on the end, Tanyeli Sabunchi, who has been working also on Just Transition here on the national level. So welcome, Tanyeli. Nice to have you on the panel.
Thank you.
So I have a few questions for the panelists so that we can get into it, and we'll obviously try and leave some space to have a bit of discussion. But what I wanted to do first was just to talk a little bit about the Alliance for Just Energy Transformation, so everybody knows kind of what we're talking about. We like to call it AJET. We like our acronyms, but what does that actually mean? So this is a coalition that we've really come together since COP28, where we have voluntary members like ICTU, like UNDP, REN21, KPMG, a lot of actors who are really interested in this idea of just transformation and how we can support that, recognizing that, you know, if we're going to deliver energy transition which really works for people, we really need to be focusing on just energy transformations. So making sure that we are thinking about the right way to do this. And that is a lot of the narrative right now, is that we have all the tools we need to actually get back on track for 1.5, but we do need to think about how we do it in a way which works for people. And in the end, if we do take that on board, we can improve equity, we can improve well-being, and that's really what this type of initiative works towards. And so I've mentioned some of the members, but there's more as well, and I think it's building as a really important coalition around this. I think the other thing to remember is that countries are doing their nationally determined ambition for climate change, and they are thinking about the transition and what it looks like. Just transition is not something which is one definition. Countries have their own definitions of just transition, but it is something that is nationally determined and really to the local context. So that's something that we're also taking into consideration. We know that about 40% of the NDCs do talk about just transition. So that needs to be improved, but that's a really good starting point. But only, you know, 70% are actually focusing on just transition and focusing a big part on how this is integrated. So that definitely needs to be strengthened. So that's why we have this work stream on NDCs, which I'm part of as the NDC Enhancement Facilitator, and our partners here are helping us push that forward. So I think that's really great. So I think I have talked enough. But you're welcome to ask questions on this later. But let's have a little bit of a dialogue, I think, amongst our speakers on just transition. So, Joy, do you mind if I turn to you first? And so maybe to kick it off, what is your perspective? What do you think is essential in terms of integrating the energy transition into NDCs?
Thank you for that question. So for us trade unions, what's important, integrating just energy transition or just transition in general is important to be integrated in the nationally determined contributions. Because when we talk about our goals to mitigate and adapt to the impacts of climate change, it's not just about the planet, it's about the people. It's about leaving no one behind. So for us, it's integrating just transition into NDCs means that it is an opportunity to ensure that the justice elements of the transition, the social dimensions of achieving the goals on mitigation and adaptation are there and present in the NDCs. It's also to ensure that, you know, the nationally determined contributions are centered on the people and the planet. It's not simply about just making sure that we transition to renewables or making sure that we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. It must go hand in hand with the interest of the people, with the welfare of the people who are, of course, living in this planet, particularly, you know, the workers who can also be impacted by climate change impacts as well as climate policies. As I mentioned earlier, it's about ensuring that no one is left behind when trying to achieve the goals set by the NDCs. And for us in the trade union movement, we think that there is no just transition without labor rights. We don't want a transition. We don't want a transition that would still, or we don't want climate policies that will also contribute to the further erosion of workers' rights. So for instance, in the case of Asia Pacific, where I'm from, workers' rights are already under attack. Workers' rights are not so protected and upheld by the states. And so this transition, when it happens in such a way that does not include the voices of the workers, who could potentially be impacted by by a transition to renewables, it will further contribute to the erosion of their rights. So, and this could happen many times. Today, while in the Philippines, the group or the unions of jeepney drivers or transport workers are calling for a national strike. They're calling for a national strike because of this policy and program that the government introduced on jeepney modernization, which means that, you know, our traditional jeepneys, if you have been to the Philippines, that's the traditional way of public transport. Most of the workers there are informal, and the government introduced the modernization program for the jeepneys to replace the jeepneys with a vehicle that is reportedly emitting lower carbon emissions. So what happens to the jeepney drivers? The cost of the new vehicle is 3 to 4 times the cost of a jeepney. It's something that a regular, you know, jeepney driver wouldn't be able to afford. There are subsidies provided by the government, but the subsidies are not enough to cover the cost of the new modern vehicle for the jeepney drivers. It was introduced to the jeepney drivers arbitrarily, one-sided, without any dialogue with the jeepney drivers themselves, especially at the start. It was only after several national strikes that the governments decided to talk to the workers, to talk to the jeepney drivers, and make sure that, not really make sure, but, you know, try to listen to their concerns. Without the involvement of the workers themselves, it is very difficult to know what they need in order to be really part of this transition, to feel like they are not left behind in the process. In some cases where the unions have been involved, such as, for example, in one area in the Philippines, when the same program is happening, the unions have been involved and they were able to present their demands that they need subsidies for the purchase of the new vehicles, that they need to be organized into cooperatives, and the government must support the organizing as well, that they need reskilling and retraining for the new vehicle. And in that process, the transition went more smoothly than in other parts of you know, the Philippines where the same is happening. So now the government, as a consequence, as well as the general public, had to deal with transport strike all the time because the jeepney drivers are not being heard. Um, in the Philippines, I mean in Asia Pacific, the level of engagement of trade unions in terms of integrating just transition in nationally determined contributions, they vary. Some trade unions are more advanced in terms of engaging with the government on the NDCs. But sometimes it's also a matter of how open is the government to these types of engagement. So far, what we can see, for instance, is in the case of Indonesia, where the trade unions have been involved in the process of consultation on the NDCs. And I think Indonesia has, at least in Southeast Asia, one of the NDCs that have a clear reference on the just transition of the workforce and the creation of decent work and quality jobs for an effective and inclusive transition to low greenhouse gas emissions. So these are, direct quotes from the NDC of Indonesia. It is about creation of employment opportunities for this transition, which is carried out in synergy with the ongoing transition towards prosperous Indonesia. It also has references to addressing challenges faced by sectors, cities, and regions in transitioning to a low carbon development and in ensuring decent future for the workers affected in the transition, and promoting greenhouse gas emissions and sustainable economic activities that will create quality jobs in cities and regions. I think the reference on job creations, the reference on employment in the NDC in Indonesia, it's a result of the trade unions' engagement with the government in the process of developing the NDCs. In the Philippines, for example, the NDC also mentioned just transition, but it's just one mention without any substance at all. There is no content. It just mentioned just transition of sectors, not of the workforce, to a green economy. And when you look at the salient points of the NDCs of the Philippines, it actually talks about more on the role of the private sector and how the private sector is the main engine for economic growth and development, including economic transformation. While there is a reference on people's organization, which does not list trade unions in the list of people's organization, which it should have meaningful consultation with, that is very much narrowed down to meaningful consultation vis-a-vis or versus the strong emphasis on the role of private sector in the NDCs. And just one point in relation to that, I think just to go back to the question on why it is important to integrate just transition in the NDCs, it's because we want to make sure that it's the justice perspective that becomes the overall and framework when we talk about transition. Unfortunately, when we look at different just energy transition plans, not necessarily the NDCs, but for example, although the Indonesia was a good example when it comes to NDCs, its comprehensive investment plan, which is a part of the just energy transition partnerships, it does not really involve trade unions in the process. I just mentioned the experience of South Africa. There is a just energy transition investment plan, which includes trade union in the process. But one commonality between the two is that the outcome in the discussion on just transition is an investment plan. It is not a just transition plan, which is centered on the people, which is centered on meaningful participation and social dialogue, which is centered on ensuring that no one is left behind, which is centered on the justice elements of this transitioning. It all becomes an issue of investment, an issue of financing. And when it happens like that, the justice elements, the social dimensions becomes watered down. And that, I think, what we should avoid when we're, developing the NDCs.
Thank you for that, Joy. a lot of great stuff in there, and really nice to hear those very specific examples. I liked how you showed sort of how the Philippines is changing its strategy on it and how the workers are really engaging. One of the things I find was particularly interesting is what you were saying about the terminology on how talking about just transition of sectors is really not taking into account the workers, and I think that's a really important point to remember. So thanks very much for that. Omar, can we turn to you? I think we've heard some really great examples in the Asia Pacific. Maybe can you give us a bit of a background on the energy transition in Africa and how this is landing in NDCs and potentially on the ground? Thanks.
Thank you, and definitely agree with everything my sister has mentioned. And you know, we are separated by a vast body of ocean in between Africa and Asia. It's at least over 15 hours to get to Vietnam and in the Philippines. But it's the realities are, you know, I'm agreeing with everything she's saying because it's the day-to-day things that we're living. So to get the things that we know about already out of the way, you know, the region I come from, which is Africa, we all know, and it's been mentioned in the hallways and the many pavilions and the many meetings that you've had people speaking about Africa, how it has contributed the least to the climate crisis. Historical emissions, we have less than 4% of the historical emissions coming from Africa. I'm sure you've been told about how a big number of the people living in energy poverty, over 80% of the global population are in Africa, which is 600 million, more than 600 million people that don't have access to electricity. We haven't even spoken about energy because we have close to 1 billion people that depend on biomass, on forests and trees to be able to get their source of energy for cooking. We have people who are dying, more people dying from indoor pollution than actually who are dying from HIV and AIDS. That's how big the problem of the energy crisis is within the continent. But we also have, and getting to the NDC conversation, I think the one thing that we've gotten it wrong when we're discussing about just energy transition, especially to the context of NDCs, I think for the rest of the world, it will be unfair that we're expecting a continent that's contributed less than 4% of the historical emissions, and we still have to push more and expecting them to do the same than what the global north is supposed to be doing. We are also talking about people, when they're talking about energy within the context of Africa, you're seeing that they're pushing more around fossil fuels. You're seeing them talking about more around oil and gas, and previously coal, but now more oil and gas, especially gas. And it's a problem because for us, every conversation that we're having around energy, it's mostly for export. It's not necessarily about how we're going to be delivering this much needed energy to the many people that need and need access. And therefore the conversation around the NDCs, it becomes important because it shouldn't be about just cutting emissions, but how does Africa develop in a way that it's climate compatible and a way that they're getting energy and they're developing as a continent by avoiding emissions altogether. So how do we leapfrog that? And the question therefore becomes quite interesting when you pose it like that, because most of the different people we've spoken to, whenever we speak about these issues, then they start running away from the conversations because one, it will mean that we need to provide this energy, and the best way to do it is through renewable energy. And no one wants to do it because all the investments that are coming to Africa, despite Africa having over 60% of the global potential for renewable energy, only 2% of the current global financing going to renewable energies is coming to Africa. If you talk about the critical minerals that we need for us to be able to explore and exploit the renewable energy opportunities, over 40% are available in Africa. If you talk about the workforce that we will need to do this work, 70% of the population in Africa are youth, people who are 35 years and under. And all of these are opportunities and we need to look at them, and therefore it's discussion that we have to put into the NDCs conversations. Now the problem that we're having with our NDCs in the whole 54, 55 countries, depending if you're considering the West Morocco to be West Sahara to be a country, you'll see that all of them are being done by experts out of Africa. So all the consultants that are looking at the NDCs within our African country context are people who are coming from out of Africa. And this is problematic because one, does it mean that we don't have the experts within Africa to do this? And not just that, but also, you know, the realities and the ideology and the understanding of the climate and energy situation that we have within the continent is different if you're not based within Africa. You don't necessarily understand. You will mostly be coming with your own biases and your own interests. And it's also because they're mostly financed by people from out of the continent. Then also you can argue that however they are being developed, it's not necessarily to benefit the continent. My country that I'm coming from, in Kenya, you'll see that we're talking about cutting carbon emissions by, I think, 80 or 90% by 2030, which is encouraging and good. But we already know that over 90% of our electricity is being supplied by renewable energy within the country. And we also know that a big well, that seems ambitious and good and something that we want to see, but it's mostly very hypothetical and very wishful thinking, so to speak. Because if you read them, you will see many of them are telling you how they need finances to be able to keep the promises they are making within their NDCs. The country that I'm resident of, they say they only have 20% of the financing that they need to keep their promise within the NDCs. They need 80% of the financing coming from out of the continent. You've all been looking and following the discussion that we're having within COP. Financing, when we're talking about the climate action and getting finance around renewable and everything that we need for adaptation and everything else, no one seems want to really be giving it serious attention. The loss and damage conversation was great, but I think we have not even gotten to $1 billion US since people started making the pledges, and this is worryful. So maybe to wrap this up, I would mention that it's important for us when we're looking at Africa and predominantly the global South, we need to look at they'll call it the Holy Trinity, not the name of the Father and the Son, but in the name of, you know, development, energy, and climate change. How are we able to deal with all of these three issues in a way that we're not affecting and exacerbating the climate crisis, but we are also improving the lives of the people? So it's an important discussion to include and have just energy transition within the national determined contribution and the NDCs. I think one of the reasons why it's important is because since Paris Agreement, came through, we've been doing our NDCs, but majority of the people are not keeping their promises. And someone wise said before that only crazy people keep doing things over and over again and expecting different results. So how do we need to change to make it better? And in my argument, it means including the people who are being affected within the whole transition project, the whole transition discussion, just energy transition discussion, because at the end of the day, we need lands of these people. We need their buy-in to make sure that they're actually coming in and they're doing the jobs that need to be done. And we also need to make sure that if they're buying in and they're looking at this as something that benefits them, then we're also going to be having less and less opposition coming from their end. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Amar. Lots of great stuff in there. And I think for me, maybe what I'll pick up in is what you were talking about, how these transitions need to be nationally determined. And we know that, but that's not just a rhetoric. That's, countries really need to be empowered to make the decisions themselves. We also have a lot of, discussions this week, especially around responsibility. But I think what I'm hearing from you, I think, and I agree, is a very strong sort of responsibility and nationally determined principles do not conflict with each other. They need to work together. So we can't have countries investing in Africa to sort of push them in the wrong direction unfairly. I think that's a really important point. So thank you for that. So Tanyeli, we're going to move to another area, so let's move to Turkey and see sort of what. So we've heard from Asia Pacific, we've heard from Africa. What about the energy transition in Turkey? So tell us a little bit about how, what is the characteristics here? How is it affecting local communities? And how is it integrating energy transition into its own nationally determined contribution?
Well, thank you very much, Shirley. I just want to let me start with the NDC and the national policy context. So we've got a net zero target for 2053. Well, I would not call it a target at the moment. It's something between a vision and a dream, because right now we have an NDC for 2030, which foresees a 41% business as usual reduction, not an absolute emission reduction, and then emissions peaking by 2038. So if you want this to be a vision rather than a dream, if you want this a goal, then we need first ambitious target, an ambitious NDC. So in this context, we've been talking about the definitions of just transformation, just transition. I've got fascinated by Joy's remark at the end, saying like it's about investment. So we're talking about an investment for our future. We're talking about an investment for a livable future for our future generations and for the current generations, and an investment for the people and by the people. If you could whip up the discussions and all the different angles of different definitions on just information. So, in the case of going back to the case of Turkey, so obviously, like in all other countries, the major source of emissions, the major source of going to this livable future is obviously cutting back their emissions on the energy sector. So when we look at the energy sector, basically, predominantly, obviously, the emissions come from the power generation sector, and 34% of our electricity is produced by coal. So, well, as a result, if you want to get into this net zero feature, net zero vision, we need to phase out coal at the end, right? So we need that. So, but at the moment, when we look at the National Energy Plan, there is no there's no reference to a coal phase out, and also, not surprisingly, within our NDC, there is no reference to a just energy transition. So in this context, what will happen to the coal-dependent communities? In many cases, the coal transforms the socioeconomic structure and also degrades the land. And it just becomes the predominant sector in the region, employing a majority of people, but also bearing the risk of local economic recession and large-scale emigration, and when the industry leaves the place eventually. For example, we've got I want to talk about a specific example, Karaman, Ermenek. This is a town in the central part of Turkey. So basically, it's a coal mine. It used to be a coal mine town. So in 2014, 10 years ago, a major accident happens in one of the coal mines, and 18 people dies. Right after that, a major change in the mining legislation in Turkey, and then in that part, it becomes sort of inefficient, let me say, for the mining operators, and then many coal mines there just closes. And right now, most of the people are there. They're unemployed, so they live in the place. So it just has the risk of becoming a ghost town. So if we want to talk about the just energy transformation in this context, we have to take into consideration the specific features of each region. So we wanted to do as WWF Turkey, we wanted to do a sort of specific study this year in the case of Tufanbeyli, south of Turkey, another place with a coal mine and a power plant. So it is basically isolated from the city center. Basically takes 2.5 hours to get to the city center by driving, even 4 hours when the conditions are worse. So quite isolated. But on the other hand, it also basically is quite not diverse economically. So not surprisingly, coal is a major source of income for most of the people. The bigger source of income, well, before coal, it used to be, now it still is, the agriculture sector. But not surprisingly, again, the income from agriculture is not a stable income. So it's quite important for the people who are working in the power plant and the and coal mines to get that stable income. So, but so the industry also fed and created other small sectors like chandlership, like local shops, housing, logistics, and retail. And but as I said, in this context, we've got limited source of, limited options of other employment in the area, which again bears the risk of large-scale unemployment and immigration eventually to emigration to other places if and probably and actually the the power plant operator has a vision to phase out coal. So it is going to happen. So that is why we specifically studied that area. So in this context, we basically need improving. We saw that there's a need of increasing the economic sectors and also improving the and transportation infrastructure, and also like building in inclusive governance structures, bringing all people together. So in the larger context, what we need for a just energy transition in Turkey, we need basically ambitious goals and integrated in all policy sectors, and most importantly within the NDC, because NDC is obviously the guiding compass for the policymakers and also the private sector, which is going to give a powerful signal. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniele. And what I kind of took for that, which I thought was quite interesting to take on, the way we've been talking about it on the scientific side, is this idea of you get cascading, sort of compounding impacts from the transition that goes into other sectors which need to be taken into account. And that really kind of takes us in to that discussion around transformation, that it's not just the energy sector that is part of this transition, it's the other sectors that are connected to that, especially when you're talking about areas which really rely on these industries. And we have had sort of, disasters in the past in some countries, especially in Europe. And I hope that we can really learn from that as we're thinking about how to do it now in the context of climate change. So I think that was really great. I do want to come to the audience for questions, but I think first I also want to ask you a question, but I will start with the panelists. So just to give you a little bit of a teaser, I'm interested on if maybe we could just identify amongst each other, for you, what is the one barrier in integrating just energy transition into NDCs? And what is one important element that you think needs to be covered in NDCs? So Joy, do you mind if I start with you? And we'll go through the panel and then I'll see if anyone from the audience wants to contribute.
The barrier, especially from the perspective of the trade union, is the lack of social dialogue when developing NDCs. As we said, in the trade union movement, there is also no just transition without workers at the table in the formulation up to the implementation of the just transition plans, including the NDCs. So basically, that's what we want. To answer the next question, we want social dialogue in this process. We want the participation, meaningful participation of trade unions in the process of developing and implementing the NDCs. It's not about ticking the box and saying that, oh, we consulted the different stakeholders. We want, genuine participation where we really have a say and part of this planning process. Because most of the time what happens is that it's a superficial consultation just for the government to say that, oh, we went through that process. And that's not enough for us. We want real social dialogue to happen in this NDC formulation.
Thanks, Joy. And I will again just remind us of what you were saying about the Philippines and the example of when you actually have social dialogue and when you don't, and how that really affects the transition. So I think that's a really good example that sort of supports that point. Omar, can I put you on the spot? What would you say is your one barrier and one important element for the NDCs?
Sorry, I'm an activist, so I'm used to shouting without the mic. But when I think of the barriers, I mean, there are many that come to mind. But if I have to mention one, I would mention the biggest barrier to me would be the access to finance. In terms of mobilizing of the finance itself. Right now, the only way you can get financing, especially from the Global South, it's through loans, not grants. And the loans are more, the interest you have to pay from the Global South is much, much higher than if you were to do it from the Global North, which is a really, really big barrier. In terms of some of the elements that I think would really be important, I think thinking of them as country-specific is good, but especially in the context of the region that we're coming from, I don't think we can do much as a nation. I mean, we can do something, but I don't think we will be successful doing it as a nation than doing it as a Pan-African regional perspective. And therefore, it would be interesting for the African continent to start thinking about it as an African situation, because now you're talking about NDCs, not just as what you're going to be cutting as emissions, but we're actually talking about opportunities, now bringing in the issues around economic of scales, and how do you actually take advantage of all the resources you have within the continent to be able to deliver the commitments you're making.
I like that challenge to sort of say, is it nationally determined in Africa, or do we need to think a bit more broadly, and let's not be too confined by the way that the system is set up from that perspective. So I think that's really great. Thanks, Omar. Tanyeli, I'm going to turn to you. Same question. Do you want me to repeat it, or are you good to go?
No, got it. Thank you. So the answer to the first question. So what is the barrier? I think it's clear. The major barrier is lack of commitment. So right now, since the beginning of this COP, we've been talking about the root cause of the problem, right? The fossil fuels and the fossil fuel phase out. And unfortunately, until now, we haven't seen that commitment. The problem is clear. We're not on course, not on track to reach 1.5 degree, and the root cause is clear: the fossil fuels and phasing out them. So without addressing the root cause of the problem, then it's not clear what we are transitioning to. So we must first agree on what we are transitioning to, what we are going, what we are on the address, and then that address must be reflected on every country's NDCs. So basically, we need clear targets, clear emission reduction targets with the root cause of the problem, and also the second one. Again, the major element that is needed there is obviously, in my perspective, is inclusivity. Inclusive and participatory, and also democratic governance processes, and addressing the root causes of the problem and what kind of feature the people want in the transforming communities, because it's the national policymakers or the private sector. They're not the single actors doing it. We need civil society, we need trade unions, we need the communities, local communities in that decision-making process, not just the engagement, but in the decision-making processes. And that should also be reflected again in the NDCs, what kind of transition are we talking about? How are we going to actually deliver it? So this is the major element, I think. Thanks.
Thanks, Daniele. And I think across the board, that's really sort of a message on the NDC shouldn't be done in isolation. This is not something that should be done by the government and not involve other people. You talked about workers, you talked about a sort of Pan-African context, and you talked about sort of the inputs into the decision-making process and making sure that includes sort of other voices. So I think that's a really important reflection. I know we've got a few people online, and I'm sorry we can't take any inputs from there, but we do have people in the room. So can I set the challenge to you guys? Does anybody want to give us from their perspective what we think one of the biggest challenges are, or important elements that they think really need to be included in these just energy transitions or national climate plans?
Thanks. Does it work? Okay, thanks. My name is Koen Stuik from Belgium office of WWF, and I wanted to add the problem that we have, I think, also is connected to the nature of the energy sources that we have, which are all very concentrated power, which is a concentrated power, opposed to renewable energy whose can be more decentralized. And I think a lot of problems that we have are connected to this fact that that we have fossil fuels and nuclear as well. These are very capital intensive ways of exploiting energy that that concentrate power in a few hands, and these they don't like to give way of this power. I think that's something that that we need to take in our consideration.
Thanks so much. I see we've got another behind us. Maybe you can.
Hi, hello everyone. So I'm Corinne from the WWF office in Germany. And I agree with all the barriers that have been identified, but maybe if I can put my other perspective. So I'm working at the moment on a project in Vietnam, Uganda, and Nepal, where we have developed with a MAP platform, so a multi-actor partnership group that has been very active and throughout the whole project has been very involved in all stages of discussing like the project results. With this active group, we have developed scenarios to 100% renewable energy, how it would look like, where could this be deployed, what would the energy mix look like all the very modeling aspects, which has been a challenge now also because you involve people that are not experts. So yeah, I would say the barrier that I see is time. Because on the one hand, you have to be fast if you want to be in line with 1.5, it needs action now, but on the other hand, like the just part takes time. You have to build trust, you have to build capacity, you have to really make room for the dialogue, otherwise it's not just, right? So I would say that's the big challenge that I see is that you have to make time for it, although you have this pressure that you don't have it. But I definitely encourage everyone to take the time to go into dialogue. And of course, there's the financial barriers and the, all of the other barriers that have been mentioned. But for me, that would be the barrier and the opportunity at the same time. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you. We have someone in the corner as well.
Thank you. Georgette, Alliance for Global Water Adaptation. I think something that is an opportunity now and then could be a barrier later is water. It's something that the just transition needs and also shouldn't negatively impact, but it can also be a tool to get there. So I think it's also, when we're talking about involving multiple, say, stakeholders or groups or communities, it's also looking at those cross-cutting themes such as water that can help us make sure it's just, make sure that people's access to water isn't negatively impacted by changes to energy, but also something that can drive forward mitigation and adaptation actions. So I would say water for both, but in the reverse order.
Thanks for that. And yes, answering these questions is always tricky because sometimes you can say something that can just transition from a risk and an opportunity depending on how you actually work with it. And that's a nice example. And I think also the other examples sort of speak to that. So I guess I haven't really changed sort of my summary on this. I think it's about participation, and it's about inclusivity, and it's about challenging governments to make sure that happens. That's how we get the expertise in to make sure that we're not shifting from these challenges, these opportunities to challenges, and we're not going in the wrong direction. That's how we make sure that we have the voices of the people who need to be a part of the transition, as well as the other parts of the sector that need to be involved in the transformation. That's how we make sure that we have this, broader thinking rather than, I guess, just what needs to happen in the national side, if it needs to be a bigger sort of, for example, Pan-Africa way of thinking about it. And again, if we need to talk about, doing this rapidly, building this trust, building this capacity, and also sort of broadening out the opportunities to maybe address some of the sort of focused, I don't want to say power-based, but I am saying power-based. I think that makes sense, it's a little bit revolutionary, but I think I think we're all kind of on the same lines here, which I think is great. I think maybe we can finish up fairly soon, but before we go, I wanted to sort of turn quickly back for, I'm sorry, I apologize. We will go to the audience again.
I mean, I wanted to deviate from the question a little bit and bring something else in, if that's possible. I think that what we've got very clearly from the panel is that there are very different country contexts to this, and that's why there is a good alignment between the concept of the energy transition, which we're doing globally, and the NDCs, because each country has very different circumstance. And so I'm from South Africa, and in the South African context, South Africa really is doing a transition because it's responsible for 30% of Africa's emissions. So, from 80% of the electricity coming from coal to essentially zero at some point, that's a massive move. Whereas for some other African countries, the energy transition is really from no energy to providing energy, and so that's more of an opportunity. But so that context also brings me in mind to sort of the labor transition process, where what we have is a whole new economy, which doesn't have a natural power base advocating for it. So, to the point there. But I mean, if we think about in the unionization, we have unions who stand to lose, and then we don't have unions for the new economy yet, right? And that needs to grow. It's an opportunity, I think, for the sort of the labor movement to start bringing in this new economy as it comes there, and to ensure that not just the sort of the transition away is a loss, but the transition to locks in those benefits. And I think that that's true across the economy. That's why it's a whole transformative process.
Thanks, that's great. And maybe that sort of helps me move into my closing remarks. So thank you very much for interrupting me there.
Can I add something?
Yeah, of course, Daniele, please.
I think one of the other important elements to be able to include just energy transition into NDCs is guidance. So how to include in them, how to do it, whether, like we've discussed here, what are the other essential elements. So, and within the next year, on their AJET, not only specifically on their AJET, but also with the help of other stakeholders, we want to continue these discussions, and at the end of the year, we basically want to come up with a set of guidance elements on how to include just energy transition into NDCs to be able to contribute to the discussions in COPs. So WWF Turkey will be leading the discussions in this context in Turkey. We want to include other contexts as well. So this was the first of a series of discussions in this context. So I really want to take the opportunity to thank everyone here who contributed this discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniele. And I feel like I keep trying to move to the end, and it's just because I'm really keen to ask my final question, and you've sort of started on that already. So I feel like this is a discussion that is in the context of the Alliance for Just Transformation, Just Energy Transformation. And so what I would like to do is maybe just get like a couple of sentences maybe from each speaker. And I know, Daniele, you've spoken a little bit before, but what do you think are the key things that this type of alliance can do to really support on these transitions? What are the key activities that you see that we can really push for? You talked a little bit already about what we're planning on doing, but it would be really great to get some additional reflections. Can I start with you, Joy?
I mentioned earlier the issue of capacity also on the ground. Capacity because they are not really informed about all these types of processes or involved in these processes. But if we could, support capacity building for workers and communities on the ground to be really part of the development and formulation of NDCs, and ensure that their voices and their perspectives are integrated in those, that would be a good start.
Thank you. That's great. And Omar, maybe I turn to you.
Yeah, I think I like the work you're saying you're doing with the modeling, with what you've done in Uganda and 2 other countries that you mentioned. I think the partnerships will really, really be important in terms of, the problem is we're normally very defensive when we're talking about just energy transition. We're always speaking up against what's being proposed to us, but we're not very good at presenting the alternative. So I think that would really, really be good. I think the other aspect will be the solidarity aspect, because there's many similarities as well in the different places that we are all based in. And I think the opportunities for people to learn, but also to see ways of supporting each other, because the only way we can win this fight is by having everyone coming on board.
Thank you, Omar. And I think we are thinking about how to present alternatives, and it would be great to kind of be more involved and sort of sense check and make sure that we really are providing what can be helpful. Daniele, do you want to say a couple of sentences before we close?
Well, first of all, sorry about messing on your plan on
Not at
closing.
all.
So I took the paper. It appears like I took the lead and saying what is essential. But to wrap up, basically, I think what we need more is more kind of these discussions, more stakeholder dialogue, and more thought exercise. But yeah, we should take the time, but not too much, right? We've got limited time, so I think we should be able to land on with solid suggestions and plans.
Great, thanks, Daniele. And you already talked about how this is one of a series of workshops, so we will be circulating information on that, and hopefully you'll be able to join us for that as well after COP, and let's just kind of keep this dialogue going so that we can come to these forums and all the other forums where it's important, and really keep pushing this message and developing the solutions approach that I think we really need here. Great, thanks very much for coming, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the time here. Hopefully we get something great, and let's keep in touch on this. Thank you.